Why the West has to fall. As someone who is Westerner German, to be precise, and who lives in and enjoys the liberties and luxuries of the Western civilization, it may come as a strange notion to say the West has to fall. However, being historian, I feel inclined in these turbulent days to separate my personal desires from what I see is going on and what has to happen and will happen anyway. There can be no doubt that we live probably in the most turbulent times globally for a pretty long time. Some may be inclined to say since World War II, but I might say since much longer. For while the European nations dragged the rest of the world into a war 2 times during the 20th century, the larger part of the world itself were not in any real crisis. We Europeans just dragged them all into it. Today is different. Today, crisis is everywhere. There is an economic crisis, wherein the ever faster running mills of turbo-capitalism seems to be like running on steroids now, an overheated machine which has reached the point where it can go no slower anymore without falling apart entirely. A speculative voodoo capitalism, which isn't the capitalism of our forefathers, the honest broker, the honorable craftsman and trader, it is a sheer asylum of lunatics out of any human control. The entire speculative nature overblows constantly and must by nature at some point simply implode. The current economy, born from the system of Western speculative capitalism, is profoundly unhealthy, unnatural and rotten. It doesn't create chances for everyone as it claims. It destroys chances and allocates an ever-growing amount of riches into a tiny group of people at the expense of almost everyone else. The distribution from poor to rich, from hard-working to lazy, is ever accelerating, and if history tells us one thing, it is that such a gap between have and have-nots always explodes in revolution and anarchy. Then there is the crisis of ideologies. The entire Islamic world seems to be in a stir, pretty convinced of its mission and woefully aware of its lack of power, the sort of identity-seeking of the Islamic world that has made the entire world pretty nervous. What role will Islam finally settle into the future world landscape? No one knows. But one thing is certain, such finding of an identity of a civilization always goes along with wars and violence. Our Christian identity finding hasn't been any more peaceful. Then of course nationalism is on the rise, as people and nations feel thrown back to their smaller regional and national identities. In a hostile, chaotic world disorder, that is not a surprising development. And one should, in the growing gap of rich and poor, not write off too quickly the basic ideas of socialism, which may find more open ears as poverty is sure to grow. Then there is Asia, once admiring the West, now turning away from what they regard as problematic individualism and liberalism, the too strong Western ideology of late, now under heavy critique from all sides. I assume for us Westerners this is the most striking and surprising development. In the late 1990s, it seemed the general consensus of the Western elite that individualism and liberalism won the war of history. The end of history was proclaimed, but it was a call all too soon. We Westerners regard individualism and liberalism as so naturally good and right ideas that we have the highest difficulties to understand how the other cultures and civilization see those two as our biggest flaws. There is a considerable amount of cultural racism in the West in assuming that our ways of individuality and liberty are the best and so good that everyone would naturally desire to copy them. The thing is, every human being assumed so about the identity and culture of his era and his region. Liberalism and individualism are ideologies, plain and simple. Every idea is an ideology. We cannot step outside of it. It is a big misconception to think we could free ourselves of ideology. Even nihilism or anarchy would be ideologies. And ideology always does one thing. It takes one idea as the idea and puts it on a pedestal and adores it as a supreme value, to which all other values must be sacrificed. For nationalism, the nation-state was the highest value. For socialism, the equal economic distribution of goods. For religions, it is the religion's creed. Individualism puts the individual on the pedestal, the ego, unto the whims and desires of the individual. Individualism and liberalism sacrificed every other value. Family and nation, religion and tradition, region and culture. Every value that was not bound to the atomized individual was to be abolished under the altar of the individual. Liberalism is a religion, a faith, a creed, in the same way all other isms competing with it. And for the Western civilization after World War II, this has been the faith and the ideology of us, the Westerners. We take that unquestioned, undoubted as the best of all ideologies, and we demand in blind arrogance that the rest of the world has to do as we do, to like what we like and to believe what we believe. That is our hubris. The so-called world wars were not world wars. It wasn't the world fighting. It was an inner Western war. In those two world wars, the West fought over the question which ideology would be the final defining ideology of the West. The various Western ideologies fought, and the powers which supported liberalism and individualism won. Ever since those became the dominant ideologies of the West, and the West assumed that in the same way that the rest of the world would embrace these ideologies too. We learn now the hard way, we were mistaken. Now, for me as historian, I am not interested in the question who is to blame. Guilt is a question for priests and lawyers. My question is, what is really going on? For it is my perception that especially we in the West do not really see what is going on. So we have two basic crises. A crisis of an economy gone wrong, and a crisis of, shall we say, different civilization models. What we can at the moment see four civilization models in the shaping. The liberal West, the Russian, or in broader sense the oligarchic one, the Asian or neo-Confucian, and the Islam. Over time a neo-socialist may form, maybe in South America or parts of Africa, as a natural result of the widespread poverty, but we are not yet that far. I assume it is the idea of people who experience a relatively long period of stability and prosperity as the Westerners did from 1950 to 2000 that they expect it to last. That is this never again mentality from which arose after the horrors of 2 world wars and the Holocaust, and it was a good and just intention. Alas, history cannot be stopped. As much as we try now with both force and negotiations to freeze a certain order of things in time, to hold the change, because we face a downward swing on the wheel of fate, such attempts always have been futile. The reality is that the West, with military strength, through economic power and with its culture as well, has dominated the globe for about 500 years. It brought both good and bad, and I am far from saying the dominance of the West was all bad. It spread benevolent ideas just the same, just as much as it also spread violence and oppression. Looking back, asking whether it was good or bad seems like a futile endeavor. I prefer to think that it was unavoidable. A civilization on the rise always expands and tries to form the others due to its own image. If anything, that seems to be a rule of human history. Civilizations rise and spread through warfare, economy, and ideas. They reach their apex, then decline and fall apart. It would be hubris to assume the Western civilization would fare any different just because we like it so much. That doesn't mean it was all for naught. The Roman Empire fell and we inherited a lot of the ideas. The Hellenistic culture fell, as did many empires and civilizations, but the new ones always built on top of the previous, some more, some less. I think the most striking similarities, and more people seem to realize this as the crisis continues and deepens, is the fall of the Roman Empire. With all the historic specifics, there is much in common we, the Western civilization, have with that of Rome. The Romans controlled the entire antique known world, in part directly through military, in part indirectly through culture and economy, the same way as we do. As the Romans, we Westerners see ourselves as the apex of civilization, the crown of culture, and the rest as either fools not seeing how good it is to be us, or as barbarians who are evil because they try to overthrow our dominance. As the Romans, we take our place for granted, and that is always where the greatest danger creeps in. People taking their place for granted become complacent, lax, and degenerate in their paths. It takes some guts, strength, and alas a good portion of inhuman violence to build empires. Let's not make one mistake. The spread of Western culture in the last 500 years wasn't achieved by gentle words. We didn't convince the rest of the world to follow our glorious culture of individualism, capitalism, and liberalism. We gunned them into submission. First, as did the Romans with their Pax Romana. Sure, after the defeat, the Celtic Gauls, later to become French, embraced and valued Roman culture. But their forefathers weren't persuaded by nice words, and what Westerners tend to forget is, they do not forget. The ears of the defeated never forget the fact that they were defeated, even if the new culture brought them prosperity. The sting of being forced into it remains forever, and may at some point bite back, even if the revenge takes centuries. We have seen that happens almost everywhere in recent decades. Europe has looked with great astonishing how Serbs, Croatians and Bosniaks went at each other's throats with the memories of wars and battles from centuries ago. We see with the same irritations as tribes and regions of Africa and Arabia fight wars of age-old quarrels. Humans are not prone to forget old wrongs, as it seems. As long as prosperity exists, people seem to forget about the past. But past wrongs have a strong tendency to return to awareness if the prosperity depletes. Blood doesn't forget, as much as that nation irritates our Western minds. It is that very Western ideology, the individualism, which hinders us to see what is truly going on. By and large, it is the nature of humanity to create bonds. Bonds that last, and all of these bonds are based on a commonly created fiction, a story which the people who feel they belong together tell each other over generations to create a we, a common identity. Life as atomized pinball, tossed around by random events, is too brutal to bear, so people create a sort of fiction. They need it to endure life. The tribe, the race, the nation, the religion, all these are the most common tales which coerce togetherness, and they are preserved in rituals and appearances. Apparently the human soul needs such storytelling, such a fiction, to belong to a comprehensible group. People define themselves much more to what they not belong than by defining to what they belong. For it is much easier to say why and to what you not belong than to define the characteristic of the group you belong to, and that is most logical, since you take your characteristic of your own group for granted. We usually grow up in it, so we can't really explain what makes us us, while we can quite sharply see what makes others different. One must understand this psychological group mind to understand what is going on, because the entire idea of group minds was challenged by the ideology of Western individualism. The ideology of individualism says, you shall have no bonds to the ego. There is only one value, and that is the entirely disconnected social atom. And so the Western system of morality started an ideological crusade against every other ideology, that of nationalism, religion, tradition, race, ethnicity, culture, family, and virtually every other idea which created something common. For it saw all these bonds only as anti-liberal, as enemy of the ideal of total freedom. And in that, individualism and liberalism are as totalitarian as its competitors, as all ideologies are. But the bitter reality we are waking up to is a society based on such an extreme totalitarian individualism simply breaks apart. It becomes so atomized, so devoid of any cohesion, that while it does not violently explode, like other systems in their fault, it simply dies of entropy. All dynamic, all development, all forces which could create any sort of movement or change die in the total individualism. It is the model of a civilization which simply stops developing. Every person in such a society of individualism and total freedom is an atom, a pinball, randomly being tossed around without anything that forms its identity but the ego, a person without bonds, without connection, a piece of merchandise to be used as economic cogwheel in supercapitalism. It is like Marx said, quote, "In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality." The reality is that the totally free individual is the totally hollow one. We form identities from history, from tradition, from obligations and bonds, and to a large degree from defining our group as different from the others. If you take that away, the individual becomes empty. It simply doesn't have enough gravity to withstand the chaos of existence. Now that what we in the West deny, the reality of the inherent failure of our society model, is something the rest of the world outside the West sees with sharp clarity. Ask the people in other civilizations, Russia and its fair, Asia, the Islamic world. They will see quite clearly that the Western individualism is about to shipwreck, and naturally they do not want to imitate a system which is falling apart right before their eyes. The problem is, the West is, in terms of military, economy and cultural influence, still so strong that we, the West, prevent change, prevent progress, prevent your natural development process called history in the same way like a cork sticks in a bottleneck. It is in the same way the Roman Empire in its last century was no longer the herald of progress, but it stood as a roadblock preventing progress. The Romans had become so accustomed to their ways, they began to regard any change as a threat. Their culture simply came to a halt. It stopped developing. If for some reason the Western Roman Empire had won over the migrating German tribes, we would live in a horribly backwater reality. I highly doubt we would have the social or technological progress that the modern era had seen in the last 500 years. Yes, it plunged us into a dark age, but that is the price for overthrowing an old system. It is a bit like the cynic saying, you cannot make an omelette without breaking some eggs. Civilizations, if they are not killed in their infancies, have the tendency to reach an apex and then try to freeze that, sort of mummify the status quo. All civilizations come to that point, and where they are unable to change anymore. If you look at the European Union and the USA, I guess that fits the description perfectly. We are societies practically incapable of any change. We are split into various interest groups and ideological leagues, and all of them cling to their status, and the powers that rule are afraid to alienate any of them, so the stalemate is preserved. The result is a society incapable of development anymore, and that is where we stand. Now one may wish that voting a different party or that wise thinking would help us, but the nature of humanity is, alas, not thus. One may wish for a different reality, but the truth is that all civilizations finally changed because there was no other way left. and that usually meant utter and total catastrophe, either from the inside by revolution, or more often they were overthrown from the outside. The gravity of our situation in the West is that for the first time the situation is global, so we cannot expect some unexpected force from the far ends of the world to confront us like the Huns to the Romans. We have much greater powers to overlook and manipulate the world, so we delay the inevitable, like raising an ever higher dam against a flood, only to create a super flood once the tremendously high dam will finally break. The irony is, the longer we delay the upheaval, the more brutal it will be. We will see that in miniature sooner or later with the Greek crisis. Greece is a failed state in delay. The basic pillars of the Greek society are rotten. In any other place than in Europe, Greece would have become a failed state years ago. But the European Union prevented and delayed the unavoidable fall, and thus made the fall, once it will happen, only more brutal. The reality of human history is Darwinistic. Flawed societies and flawed systems fall. They must fall, not necessarily making place for morally better society, for morality is no logical part of change and progress. Vital societies push less vital societies aside. The vigorous and exuberant culture replaces the weaker one. Those vigorous may be the morally much less developed, full of violence and oppression. The relatively primitive German tribes and the Huns overran the developed and refined Romans, and in a similar way the vigorous culture of Islam currently confronts the complacent West. Under our skin, we feel the challenge of Islam quite well, even if we deny the reality of the threat. Islam offers just that what the liberal individualism denies to people: bonds, rules, commonalities, obligations. Culture and people with a commonality, whatever the source of it, may be at the long run be quite superior to culture with only individual self-interest reigning. In that perspective, Islam is a much superior civilization because it didn't forfeit commonality to the ego. It is just for the foreseeable future bogged down by the tribalism which all civilizations are plagued in the early days. The reality is the people living in the comfortable, luxurious lives of the West have no idea how dangerous broken people can be. Reality outside the comfy West is harsh, and we in part owe a lot of our well-being to their misery, from the $5 shirt stitched together in Bangladesh, of the cheap coffee to the oil we get from dictator regimes. A lot of our luxurious life is built on the misery of others. But of course the poor countries themselves are not without blame. Even if we were entirely blameless, which we are not, it would not matter at all. People who live in constant poverty, oppression and pain are capable of things we living in our comfy apartments cannot fathom. Every single time, the comfortable citizens of a developed empire were surprised when the rioting horde stood before their city gates. They never expected it because they concluded from their state of mind, living in relatively secure and well-fed status, to the mindset of people knowing true need and experiencing true suffering. Not our first world sufferings like obesity or social anxiety. No, existential suffering, like seeing your wife bombed to death, or seeing your father beheaded, or seeing your family die in a cheap Benetton factory which creates cheap First World t-shirts. That sort of suffering. The people living comfortable lives have no idea how dangerous broken people can be. Civilization models and cultures have always been competing with each other, and one continually replaces the other. On small and big level, people can actually vanish. So the Sumerians were removed by the Semitic Babylonians. The British Celts were tossed out of history by the Anglo-Saxons. The Native American culture has been marginalized by invading Europeans. The Chinese currently remove Tibetans from world history. The East and West Goth vanished during the people migration, and the East Hellenistic cultures were destroyed by the Seljuk Turks, and the list goes on. It would be folly to assume that this would come to a halt just because we wish it so. History is endless struggle. It is a competition of cultures, civilizations, ethnicities, and ideologies. It always has been and always will be so, for any culture or civilization which stops to struggle falls to those civilizations who did not stop to fight. It may be reason to be sad by all means, but we must accept that an end of this change would in the long run be the far greater horror, the horror of a society incapable of any change, a living mummy where the status quo is never challenged. As a Westerner, it is sad to live in times of decline of one's own civilization, but as it is, there is no avoiding the struggle.